February 23, 1945. Iwo Jima. The sound reached them first through the volcanic rock, a metallic grinding that didn't belong to artillery or small arms fire. Corporal Kiyoshi Endo pressed his ear against the cold concrete wall of the pillbox, trying to place it. Behind him, 7 other men from the 145th Infantry Regiment waited in silence, their breath visible in the damp air that filtered through the ventilation shaft. The sound grew louder, not the high-pitched whine of aircraft engines, not the rumble of naval guns offshore. This was closer, mechanical, deliberate. Through the narrow firing slit, Endo could see the black volcanic sand of the airfield stretching toward the American lines. Nothing moved. Then he saw it, a Sherman tank, painted the dull olive green of all-American armor. But something about this one looked different. The barrel of the 75mm gun seemed oddly proportioned, and as it drew closer, Endo realized why. It wasn't a gun at all. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tank stopped perhaps 100 yards from their position. Endo had seen American armor before, had watched shells bounce off their thick plates while Japanese anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate them. But this tank wasn't firing its main gun. Instead, from what looked like the barrel, a jet of orange flame suddenly arced across the sand, reaching farther than Endo had thought possible, farther than any handheld flamethrower could reach. The flame reached their secondary position, a shallow trench where 4 men had been dug in since dawn. Endo watched them emerge, screaming, their uniforms aflame. They ran toward the pillbox, but the fire had already done its work. What Endo witnessed that day on Iwo Jima would be replicated across the Pacific in the final months of the war. The American flamethrower tank, known to Marines as the Zippo after the famous lighter, represented something that Japanese military doctrine had not prepared its soldiers to face. A weapon that combined the psychological terror of fire with the invulnerability of armor. A weapon that, according to a 1st Marine Division history, was the one weapon that caused the Japanese to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. But the story of what Japanese soldiers really thought about these tanks cannot be told through American sources alone. It exists in the gap between what American commanders observed, what Japanese officers reported, and what the men in the caves and pillboxes experienced when they heard that grinding sound approaching through the volcanic ash. The development of the American flamethrower tank began not with engineers in Detroit or Aberdeen, but with a problem that became clear in the blood-soaked coral of Tarawa in November 1943. The 2nd Marine Division had used 60 portable flamethrowers during that assault, and they had proven devastatingly effective against Japanese bunkers and pillboxes. But the men who carried those weapons had a life expectancy measured in minutes. For minutes on average, according to Marine Corps estimates, the backpack flamethrowers weighed 70 pounds, held compressed gas and liquid fuel, and produced bright orange flames visible from hundreds of yards away. Japanese snipers learned to target them first. The flamethrower operators moved slowly under the weight of their equipment, and the close range required for effectiveness, usually less than 20 yards, made them extremely vulnerable to small arms fire. At Tarawa, where over 1,000 Marines died in 4 days, the need for a better solution became obvious. The answer came from the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, working at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii under Colonel Unmacked of the Army Chemical Warfare Service. They started with light tanks, modifying them with flamethrowers that replaced the machine guns. These early versions, called Satans, had a range of 40 to 80 yards and limited traverse, but they proved the concept could work. Then, in preparation for Iwo Jima, they found 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks and began a more ambitious conversion. The Seabees worked around the clock. Each conversion required 150 pounds of welding rod, 1,100 electrical connections, and cost between $20,000 and $25,000 per tank. The final design mounted a flamethrower that replaced the 75mm main gun, disguising it to look like standard armament. The weapon used 300 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel pressurized to 300 pounds per square inch. It could traverse 270 degrees, and it had a range of 400 feet, more than twice the distance of any portable flamethrower. The Marines called them Zippos. The Navy designated them M4A3R3 or POA CWS H1, depending on which bureaucratic system was doing the naming. But to the Japanese soldiers who first encountered them on Iwo Jima in February 1945, they were something else entirely. A nightmare that combined every tactical advantage the Americans possessed. To understand what Japanese soldiers thought about these weapons requires understanding what they had been taught to expect from American armor. Japanese anti-tank doctrine in 1945 was built around desperation and suicide attacks. The Type 95 light tank that Japan fielded weighed less than 8 tons and mounted a 37mm gun that couldn't penetrate Sherman armor at combat range. When Japanese armor encountered American Shermans on Saipan in June 1944, in the largest tank battle of the Pacific War, more than 30 Japanese tanks were destroyed. The American gunners found that armor-piercing rounds passed straight through the thin Japanese armor without detonating. So they switched to high-explosive ammunition and simply blasted the tanks apart. Japanese infantry anti-tank weapons weren't much better. The Type 97 anti-tank rifle fired a 20mm round that could barely scratch a Sherman's frontal armor. Magnetic mines worked in theory, but required a soldier to approach the tank close enough to attach them, usually a suicide mission. Satchel charges, improvised explosives wrapped in canvas bags, were more effective but equally suicidal to employ. The standard doctrine called for soldiers to hide in foxholes until a tank passed overhead, then climb onto it and place explosives near vulnerable points like the engine or tracks. Few men survived such attempts. This meant that by 1945 Japanese soldiers had developed a specific tactical response to American armor. When tanks approached, you stayed hidden. You remained in your pillbox or cave, protected by reinforced concrete walls 4 feet thick in some positions. You waited for the tank to pass or for American infantry to separate from their armor support. Then you emerged and engaged the vulnerable foot soldiers. It was a doctrine born of weakness, but it worked when the alternative was certain death in a frontal assault against superior firepower. The flamethrower tank destroyed that doctrine completely. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi understood what was coming to Iwo Jima. The 54-year-old commander had spent months transforming the 8-square-mile island into the most formidable defensive position in the Pacific. He had studied the American landings at Tarawa and Saipan. He knew that traditional Japanese tactics, the beach defense and banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles, would fail against American firepower. So he changed everything. Kurabayashi banned banzai charges. He ordered his men to abandon the beaches and instead dig into the volcanic rock of the island's interior. Mining engineers came from Japan with blueprints for an underground fortress. The result was 18 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of pillboxes, bunkers, and artillery positions. Some caves could hold 3 men. Others held 300. They were stocked with food, water, ammunition. They had multiple entrances to prevent entombment if one exit was blocked. The ventilation systems were designed to withstand bombardment. Many positions were so deeply buried that American shells couldn't reach them. The island's volcanic ash, when mixed with cement, produced concrete of exceptional quality. Pillboxes near the beaches had walls 4 feet thick. Machine gun positions were dug into hillsides at angles that made them nearly invisible from the air. Artillery pieces were concealed in caves, rolled out to fire, then pulled back before American counter-battery fire could find them. Kurabayashi had 21,000 men under his command, and he had spent months training them for one purpose, to make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. But he had no answer for what the Americans were about to bring ashore. The 8 flamethrower tanks landed on Iwo Jima on the first day, February 19, 1945. They didn't go into action immediately. D+1 and D+2 saw them used sparingly as the Marines struggled across the black volcanic sand that sucked at their boots and provided no cover. Then, as the battle moved inland toward the heavily fortified interior, the calls for the flame tanks began to increase. The first time Japanese soldiers saw what these machines could do changed something fundamental in the battle. A Marine Tank Battalion report described the tank's effectiveness in clinical terms. They could direct prolonged heat treatment into virtually every recess of a cave system. The large fuel capacity, 300 gallons, meant they could burn continuously where portable flamethrowers ran out of fuel within seconds. But these technical descriptions don't capture what it meant to be inside a fortified position when a Zippo approached. The sound came first. The grinding of treads on volcanic rock, distinct from regular Shermans because the flame tanks moved differently, more deliberately. They knew they couldn't be stopped by small arms fire. Regular anti-tank weapons were useless because the crews would simply keep the flame stream trained on any position that opened fire. Then the flame itself. At 400 feet range, the jet of napalm reached positions that Japanese soldiers had thought were safely out of reach. The fuel burned at temperatures that melted steel. But that wasn't what drove men from their positions. It was what happened inside an enclosed space when that flame reached the entrance. The oxygen disappeared first. Men gasped for air that wasn't there. The temperature inside the confined space rose rapidly, cooking the air itself. Smoke from the burning fuel filled the tunnels, choking anyone who tried to breathe. The flame didn't have to reach you directly to kill you. Multiple Japanese positions on Iwo Jima were found after the battle with men dead inside. No visible burns, killed by asphyxiation or by inhaling superheated air that burned their lungs from the inside. A CB electrician's mate who operated a flame tank for 20 days on Iwo Jima wrote in a personal letter that he could complete in 6 hours with 4 loads of fuel what a tank battalion and 3 infantry companies had been trying to do for 5 days. The infantry would sooner see 1 flamethrower tank than a dozen with 75s, he wrote. But he was describing the effect from outside the target. Inside, Japanese soldiers faced a choice that no amount of training or ideological indoctrination could prepare them for. Stay in the position and die from fire or asphyxiation, or run and face American machine guns in the open. The 4th Marine Tank Battalion reported that the flamethrower was probably the most valuable single weapon employed at Iwo Jima. The commander of the 5th Marine Division stated that events proved that the flamethrower tank was the most important single weapon available to his division. But these assessments, while accurate, don't address what they meant for the men on the receiving end. Corporal Endo, the man who watched that first tank approach his pillbox on the airfield, survived the war. He was one of only 216 Japanese prisoners taken on Iwo Jima out of a garrison of 21,000. In post-war interviews, he described the moment the flame tank appeared not in tactical terms but in psychological ones. The regular Shermans, he said, we could hide from. We knew their guns couldn't reach us in our concrete positions. But the fire, you couldn't hide from fire, came into the caves. It came through the ventilation shafts. There was nowhere to go. This was the fundamental shift. Japanese defensive doctrine on Iwo Jima was built on the strength of their fortifications. Kurabayashi had turned the island into a fortress specifically because he knew surface positions couldn't survive American firepower. The Marines would have to dig his men out of the rock itself. And that would cost time and lives. Except the flamethrower tanks rendered the fortifications irrelevant. You could have 4 feet of reinforced concrete between you and the Americans, and it didn't matter. The fire came in anyway. On the second day of the flame tank's employment, the casualty rate among portable flamethrower operators in 1 Marine battalion reached 92%. The tanks were pooled, not assigned to specific units, and dispatched from refueling locations as calls came in. Marines began holding up their assaults until a flame tank was available. The tanks became so critical that Japanese soldiers began mounting suicide attacks specifically to stop them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain Frank Caldwell, a company commander with the 26th Marines, said in an after-action report that in his view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won the Battle of Iwo Jima. The 23rd Regimental Combat Team reported the tanks as highly successful. But success in this context meant something specific. It meant breaking the will of soldiers who had been told they could hold against American attacks by staying in their fortified positions. The psychological impact went beyond the immediate tactical situation. Word spread through the Japanese defensive network. Radio communications were still functioning in the first weeks of the battle. Men in one sector could hear what was happening in another. And what they heard was that the Americans had brought a weapon that could force them out of positions that were supposed to be impregnable. The Japanese had a name for the tanks. In captured documents and post-war accounts, they're referred to as M1 tanks, possibly a mistranslation of the MH1 designation. But the name didn't matter as much as the reputation. The burning tanks. The machines that meant certain death if you stayed and probable death if you ran. American commanders noticed something during the Iwo Jima battle. Japanese soldiers, who had fought with suicidal determination at Saipan and Tinian, began emerging from caves with their hands up when flame tanks approached. Not in large numbers, the total prisoner count remained minuscule. But the fact that any surrendered at all was notable. Japanese military culture, reinforced by years of propaganda, held that capture was the ultimate dishonor. Soldiers had been told that Americans tortured prisoners, that surrender would disgrace their families, that death was preferable to captivity. Yet when faced with the flame tanks, some chose capture over burning. This wasn't cowardice. It was the rational response of men confronting a weapon they couldn't fight. A regular Sherman, you could try to hide from it. A flamethrower operator on foot, you could kill him if you had good aim and steady nerves. But a flame tank combined the invulnerability of armor with a weapon that forced you out of cover. The tactical equation had no solution that allowed survival. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. In that time, the 8 flame tanks used approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm. That's an average of about 277 gallons per day, burning across an island only 8 square miles in size. The Marines took nearly 27,000 casualties, including almost 7,000 killed. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only about 1,000 survived to the end of organized resistance, and most of those would die in the weeks and months of mopping up operations that followed. The flame tanks played a disproportionate role in that outcome. Not because they killed more Japanese soldiers than conventional weapons, the total count is impossible to determine precisely, but because they broke the defensive strategy that Kuribayashi had spent months perfecting. They made the fortifications that were supposed to bleed the Americans white into death traps for the defenders. Post-battle assessments noted something that would have seemed impossible before Iwo Jima. American troops preferred to follow flame tanks over standard armor when assaulting fortified positions. The tanks had what the Army called a psychological presence on the battlefield. The Japanese feared them, and that fear was tactically useful because it forced defenders to make bad decisions. Staying in position meant certain death. Emerging meant exposure to American infantry. Both options were terrible, but the choice itself disrupted Japanese defensive coordination. The success at Iwo Jima led to expanded production. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, called for hundreds of flame tanks. The Army's 10th Army preparing for Okinawa requested 54 mechanized flamethrowers. The entire 713th Tank Battalion was provisionally converted to flame, tasked with supporting both Army and Marine Corps assault forces. On Okinawa, which the Americans invaded in April 1945, the flame tanks encountered defensive systems even more sophisticated than Iwo Jima. The Japanese had built a network of fortified hills, caves, and tunnels across the southern part of the island. Natural caves had been expanded and connected. Shuri Castle sat at the center of a defensive zone that would take American forces months to crack. The flame tanks were employed differently on Okinawa. Commanders had learned from Iwo Jima that fuel capacity was limiting. Some tanks were fitted with 400-foot hoses connected to the main fuel tank, allowing infantry to carry what amounted to a portable flamethrower fed from a mobile reservoir. This variation could throw flame about 60 feet, not as far as the main gun, but it allowed the fuel supply to reach terrain the tank itself couldn't navigate. The 713th Tank Battalion went through 200,000 gallons of napalm on Okinawa. Let that sink in for a moment. 200,000 gallons. The Seabees had developed a stabilized flamethrower fuel, a thickened version of napalm that burned longer and stuck to surfaces better than earlier formulations. They constructed an activating plant that produced over 250,000 gallons of the material. The Army said after Okinawa that the flame tanks had proven their value not just tactically but psychologically. They put fear in the enemy. That phrase appears again and again in American assessments. The fear they put in the enemy. But what did that fear look like from the other side? The terrain on Okinawa favored the defender in ways that Iwo Jima had not. Ridge lines and escarpments turned the battlefield into a series of small, vicious fights. Dense vegetation disappeared quickly under American bombardment, leaving the defenders exposed on bare rock. But the caves remained. Natural limestone caverns had been reinforced with concrete and timber, expanded into networks that could house hundreds of men. Some positions had multiple entrances, designed to prevent entombment if one exit was sealed. The Japanese 32nd Army had chosen this ground deliberately. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima knew his forces could not stop the Americans on the beaches. He had watched what happened at Tarawa and Saipan and Guam. So he abandoned the coastline and pulled his army south into terrain that would bleed the Americans for every yard they advanced. The strategy worked. The battle would last 82 days, making it the longest campaign of the Pacific War. American forces faced a problem they had not anticipated. The Japanese were not fighting to win. They were fighting to delay. Every day that Okinawa held was another day for the homeland to prepare its defenses. Ushijima's orders to his men were clear. Extract the maximum American casualties. Hold positions until they became untenable. Withdraw only when staying meant annihilation without inflicting further damage. And never surrender. The flame tanks changed that calculation. Marines in the 1st Marine Division called Wana Draw the Death Valley. It was a meandering ravine with towering valley walls on both sides, honeycombed with caves and pillboxes. The 7th Marines lost 700 men taking Dakeshi Ridge just north of Wana. Then they lost another 500 in 5 days at Wana itself. The Japanese positions were on the reverse slopes, protected from direct fire. American weapons couldn't reach them, but fuel could. Marines improvised. They manhandled barrels of napalm to the top of the ridge lines, smashed the tops open with rifle butts and axes, then rolled the open containers down into the draw. When the barrels reached the caves, Marines above ignited them with white phosphorus grenades. The result was a firestorm that consumed everything in the confined space. Still, the Japanese held. From May 11th through May 30th, the 1st Marine Division lost 200 men for every 100 yards of ground they captured in Wana Draw. This was where the flame tanks proved their worth. They could park at positions the Japanese considered out of range and send fire into caves that conventional weapons couldn't touch. The hose extension tactic developed on Okinawa allowed nozzlemen to reach caves the tanks themselves couldn't approach. A tank would park as close as possible, then a crew member would drag the hose the remaining distance, ignite the fuel, and direct the flame into the cave entrance. What happened inside those caves when the flame came through has been documented by the survivors, though their accounts are difficult to reconcile with the human imagination. The fire itself was only part of the horror. In an enclosed space, the oxygen vanished within seconds. Men gasped for air that wasn't there. The temperature rose so rapidly that it cooked the air itself, burning lungs from the inside without a single flame touching skin. Smoke filled the tunnels, thick black clouds that made breathing impossible even if oxygen remained. Some Japanese soldiers tried to escape. They ran toward the cave entrance directly into American machine gun fire. Others went deeper into the cave systems, hoping to find an alternate exit or simply trying to get away from the fire. Many found themselves trapped as the smoke and heat followed them through the tunnels. In caves with multiple chambers, men who had survived the initial flame died hours later from smoke inhalation or from the superheated air that made breathing lethal. Post-war interviews with Japanese survivors reveal something that American commanders had observed but not fully understood. The flame tanks broke something fundamental in the Japanese defensive psychology. A soldier named Masao Watanabe, who survived Okinawa, described the moment a flame tank approached his position near Shuri. He said the sound was different from regular tanks. Slower, more deliberate. The tank didn't need to hurry because it knew you couldn't stop it. When the fire came, it came through ventilation shafts they thought were too small, through gaps in the concrete they thought were sealed, through spaces they didn't know existed. We were told to hold our positions, Watanabe said in an interview decades after the war. We were told that the Americans would have to dig us out man by man. We were told that our fortifications would protect us. But when the fire came, none of that mattered. You could not fight fire with a rifle. You could not hold your position when there was no air to breathe. You could only run or die. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate targets. Japanese soldiers in nearby positions could hear what happened when the flame tanks came. They heard the grinding approach. They heard the whoosh of the ignition. They heard the screams. And they knew that their positions, no matter how well built, would not save them when their turn came. This created a problem for Japanese commanders that hadn't existed before. Discipline began to crack. Not in obvious ways, not in mass desertions or refusals to fight, but in the small decisions that accumulated into tactical failures. Men who heard the flame tanks approaching would sometimes leave their positions before the tank arrived, moving to secondary positions that seemed safer. Others would try to seal themselves deeper in the cave systems, abandoning the firing positions that covered approaches to neighboring defenses. American intelligence officers noticed something during interrogations of the few Japanese prisoners taken on Okinawa. Many of them mentioned the flame tanks specifically as the reason they had emerged from their positions. Not to surrender necessarily, but because staying meant death by fire, and that death was worse than facing American bullets. Some said they had been willing to die fighting, had been prepared to hold their positions until they were killed. But they were not prepared to burn. Private First Class Yukio Nakamura was 19 years old when the Americans landed on Okinawa. He was stationed in a cave system near Shuri with 42 other men from his company. Their position had been carefully prepared. Multiple chambers connected by low tunnels, stored food and water, ammunition stacked near firing positions, ventilation shafts cleverly disguised. They had watched American attacks fail against similar positions elsewhere. They believed they could hold. On May 18, 1945, a flame tank appeared at the entrance to their cave system. Nakamura, speaking to researchers after the war, said he had heard about the flame tanks but had never seen one. The sound it made, he said, was like nothing else. Not the explosive crack of artillery or the sharp bark of tank cannon. Just this low, steady mechanical grinding, and then the roar as the flame ignited. The fire didn't reach Nakamura's chamber directly. He was in a secondary position deeper in the cave. But within seconds, the oxygen was gone. He tried to breathe and couldn't. The man next to him clawed at his throat. Men deeper in the system started screaming. Then the smoke came, thick and black, filling the tunnel. Nakamura crawled toward what he thought was an exit. He found himself at a ventilation shaft, too small to fit through, but close enough to the surface to get a breath of air. He stayed there for 3 hours while the tank systematically burned every entrance to the cave system. When the tank finally left, 18 men from his company were dead. Not from bullets or explosions, from the fire that had never touched them directly. Nakamura and the survivors emerged that night and tried to reach Japanese lines farther south. Of the 43 men who had been in that position, only 11 survived the battle. These individual accounts, collected after the war from the handful of Japanese soldiers who surrendered or were captured, paint a picture that American reports only hinted at. The flame tanks didn't just kill defenders. They destroyed the psychological foundation of the Japanese defensive strategy. The belief that well-prepared positions could be held. The certainty that American firepower, while overwhelming, could be endured if you stayed underground. The conviction that death in combat, if it came, would at least be a soldier's death. The fire offered no such dignity. Men died gasping for air in the dark, or they ran into the open and were cut down while trying to breathe. There was no heroic last stand against the flame. There was only the desperate animal choice between burning and running, between dying slowly in the smoke or quickly in the machine gun fire. But the story of what Japanese soldiers thought about the flame tanks cannot end with individual experiences. It must also account for what those experiences meant for the wider battle, and for the planned invasion of Japan that never came. By late May 1945, American forces on Okinawa had pushed the Japanese back to the island's southern tip. The defensive lines that were supposed to hold for months had collapsed in weeks. The flame tanks had been used in over 600 separate actions across the southern half of the island. The 200,000 gallons of napalm had done what conventional weapons could not. They had forced defenders out of positions that were supposed to be impregnable. The casualty figures tell part of the story. American forces suffered over 49,000 casualties on Okinawa, including more than 12,000 killed. These were devastating numbers, the highest of any Pacific campaign. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers died. Another 7,000 were captured, an unprecedented number for a Japanese garrison. And perhaps most significantly, as many as 100,000 Okinawan civilians died, many of them caught in the crossfire or forced into suicide attacks by Japanese commanders who believed the Americans would torture and kill them. These civilian deaths reflected something that the flame tanks had revealed about the Japanese defensive strategy. It was unsustainable. The willingness to die rather than surrender, the determination to extract maximum American casualties regardless of the cost, the decision to turn every cave and hillside into a fortress. All of this had made sense when Japanese commanders believed their positions could hold. But the flame tanks had proven that belief false. American planners studying the Okinawa campaign drew specific conclusions about the flame tanks' role in any invasion of the Japanese homeland. Operation Downfall, the planned assault on Japan, called for hundreds of flame tanks. Entire tank battalions would be converted. The activating plants producing napalm-thickened fuel would expand production dramatically. The hose extension tactic developed on Okinawa would become standard procedure. But there was another conclusion buried in the after-action reports. The Japanese had lost not just because their positions fell, but because their soldiers' will to hold those positions had been broken. A report from the 10th Army on Okinawa noted that the flame tanks had a profound psychological effect on enemy troops. It was one of the few times in the Pacific War that American commanders acknowledged that Japanese soldiers could be psychologically defeated, not just killed. This mattered because it suggested something about what an invasion of Japan might look like. American casualty estimates for downfall ran into the hundreds of thousands. Some planners predicted 1 million Allied casualties. These estimates assumed that Japanese soldiers and civilians would fight with the same fanatical determination they had shown throughout the war. But Okinawa suggested that determination had limits. When faced with weapons they couldn't fight, in positions that couldn't protect them, some Japanese soldiers chose surrender over death. Not many, but enough to notice. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 made the invasion unnecessary. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The flame tanks never reached the Japanese homeland. But the psychological impact they had on Okinawa influenced American planning for that invasion in ways that are still being studied today. What did Japanese soldiers really think about American flamethrower tanks? The answer is not simple. Cannot be reduced to a single emotion or response. Fear, certainly. The physical terror of fire is primal and universal. But there was more than fear. There was the betrayal of expectations. They had been told their fortifications would protect them. They had been promised that American firepower, while overwhelming, could be survived if they stayed underground. The flame tanks proved those promises false. There was anger at their commanders who had assured them the caves were safe, at the Americans who had brought this weapon to the battlefield, at themselves for the moments when training and ideology failed and they simply wanted to breathe, to get away from the fire, to live. And there was resignation, the recognition, spreading slowly through the surviving defenders, that this war could not be won. That the material superiority of the Americans was so complete that it had produced weapons against which courage and determination offered no defense. A soldier could be brave. A soldier could be willing to die. But a soldier could not hold a position that was being systematically burned out, chamber by chamber, cave by cave. In post-war Japan, as veterans returned and slowly began speaking about their experiences, the flame tanks occupied a particular place in memory. They were not discussed often. The shame of defeat, the trauma of what many had witnessed, the complex feelings about having survived when so many died. All of this made the war years a subject most veterans avoided. But when they did speak, the flame tanks came up again and again. Not as a weapon like other weapons, but as the thing that broke them. A Japanese officer interviewed in the 1970s, who had commanded a company on Okinawa and was one of the few officers to survive the battle, put it this way. We could accept death from artillery or bombs or even in close combat with American infantry. These were the fortunes of war. But the fire, that was different. It gave us no chance to fight back. It offered no opportunity for courage or skill. It simply burned and we either ran or died. That was not war as we understood it. That was extermination. That word, extermination, appears in several Japanese veteran accounts. It reflects something about how the flame tanks were perceived. Not as a tactical weapon, though they certainly were that, but as a weapon that reduced human beings to animals fleeing fire, stripped of the dignities of combat, reduced to the basic instinct to escape heat and smoke and suffocation. The American military understood this psychological dimension at least partially. Reports from both Iwo Jima and Okinawa noted that the flame tanks caused Japanese soldiers to abandon positions they might otherwise have held. The weapons put fear in the enemy, made them more likely to emerge from caves, created opportunities for American infantry and tanks to advance with fewer casualties. But the American reports don't fully capture what that fear meant for the individuals experiencing it. The gradual erosion of belief in their own defensive systems. The knowledge that the caves, which were supposed to be refuges, had become traps. The impossible choices between forms of death. The breakdown of the ideology that had sustained them through years of training and combat. In the broader context of World War II in the Pacific, the flamethrower tanks represent a particular kind of technological and tactical innovation. The Americans faced an enemy who had turned every island, every hill, every cave into a fortress. Conventional weapons could not break these defenses quickly enough. Casualties mounted. Battles that were supposed to take days stretched into weeks. So engineers designed a weapon that combined mobility, armor protection, and the primordial terror of fire into a single system. The flame tanks worked. They achieved their tactical objectives. They saved American lives by ending battles more quickly than conventional weapons could. They forced Japanese defenders out of positions that might have taken weeks to reduce by other means. By every military metric, they were successful weapons. But success in war is measured in bodies and territory, not in the psychological cost to those on the receiving end. The Japanese soldiers who faced these tanks, who heard them grinding through volcanic ash toward their positions, who felt the oxygen vanish and the temperature rise and the smoke fill their lungs. They paid a price that cannot be calculated in casualty figures. Some of them survived. They returned to Japan after the war, to a country destroyed and occupied, their emperor's divinity renounced, their military disbanded. They carried with them the memory of those caves, the sound of the flame igniting, the screams of men dying in ways that training had never prepared them for, the knowledge that they had run when they were supposed to stand, that they had chosen life over honor when the fire came. Others died. They died in the caves of Iwo Jima and the draws of Okinawa. They died from burns, from asphyxiation, from superheated air that cooked their lungs. They died trying to escape, cut down by machine gun fire as they emerged from positions they could no longer hold. They died believing, perhaps, that their deaths served some larger purpose, that they were buying time for the homeland, that their sacrifice would be remembered. The flame tanks were retired after the war, most of them scrapped or converted back to standard Shermans. The technology evolved into other systems, other weapons. But for the men who faced them in the Pacific, they remained singular. A weapon that didn't just kill but that broke the fundamental assumptions about how soldiers could defend, how fortifications could protect, how courage and training could matter in the face of overwhelming force. What Japanese soldiers really thought about American flamethrower tanks was this. They thought about survival, about the moment when ideology and training gave way to the simple animal need to breathe, about the choice between burning and running, about positions that were supposed to be safe turning into tombs, about the grinding sound that meant your time had come and there was nothing you could do to stop it. They thought about the men who died screaming, the friends who clawed at their own throats trying to find air that wasn't there, the officers who ordered them to hold positions that were already burning, the civilians who had believed the Japanese army would protect them and instead brought the fire down upon them. And they thought about the Americans who had built these machines, who had solved the tactical problem of Japanese fortifications with a weapon that turned caves into ovens, who had understood that the greatest fear is not death itself but death by fire in the dark, with no way to fight back, no dignity, no honor, just heat and smoke and the desperate failing search for one more breath. The flame tanks won battles. They saved American lives. They shortened campaigns that might have dragged on for months. They were, by every military standard, effective weapons. But they were also something more. They were the weapon that showed Japanese soldiers that their defensive strategy had no answer, that their fortifications could not protect them, that their willingness to die, while genuine, was not enough to hold ground against an enemy with the industrial capacity to create weapons specifically designed to make their defensive positions uninhabitable. In the end, what Japanese soldiers thought about American flamethrower tanks was inseparable from what they thought about the war itself. That it could not be won. That the material superiority of the Allies was too great to overcome. That the defensive strategy of bleeding the Americans in every cave and on every hill would only result in their own annihilation. That the homeland they were defending was already lost, and they were simply dying to delay the inevitable. The flame tanks didn't create these realizations, but they made them undeniable. When a weapon could reach you in positions that were supposed to be impregnable, when staying meant burning and running meant being shot, when training and courage and determination offered no defense, what was left except the knowledge that the war was over, even if the dying continued? Corporal Kiyoshi Endo, who watched that first flame tank approach his pillbox on Iwo Jima in February 1945, survived the battle. He was captured on March 15 when his position was overrun. He spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Hawaii, returned to Japan in 1946, and lived until 1998. In interviews late in his life, he was asked what he remembered most clearly about the battle. He said it was the sound of that tank, the way it ground through the volcanic sand, the way you knew what was coming but couldn't stop it, the way the fire reached everywhere you thought was safe. That, he said, was when he knew they would lose. Not because the Americans had more men or more guns or more ships, but because they had a weapon that made it impossible to do what Japanese doctrine required. You couldn't hold a position that was burning. You couldn't die with honor gasping for air in the dark. You could only run or burn or surrender. And none of those options were supposed to exist for a Japanese soldier. But they did exist. The flame tanks made them exist. And in making them exist, they broke something that all the other American weapons combined had not managed to break. The belief that Japanese fortifications could hold, that caves could protect, that determination alone could be enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.